For the sake of the shorthand writer, I think we'll take a slightly early lunch. So it'll be round about 12:30 at a convenient moment, if that's suitable.
Thank you. I wanted to take you to a document. So could we have up, please, RLIT 301605. Do you have that?
Yes.
Excellent. Right, well, we can see that this is the 26th annual report from 2017 of the of CJD surveillance in the UK from the Research and Surveillance Unit, and it was page 11 that I wanted to look at with you. And we can see here it's headed VCJD,
yes.
And it's to get an idea of the numbers of cases. So it says here that up to 31st of December 2017, 178 cases of definite or probable VCJD had been identified in the UK, 123 definite, and 55 probable cases who did not undergo post-mortem. Now, Professor Collins told us that that was the difference between the two. Probable is simply those cases that haven't had post-mortem, but you are still confident of diagnosis. Is that right?
Yes, but probable in this case means a very, very highly probable, yes.
75, 42% of the 178 cases were female and 103 or 58% were male. The median age at onset of disease was 26.5 years, and the median age at death, 28 years, compared with 67 years for the median age at onset and 68 years for the median age at death for sporadic CJD. The youngest case was aged 12 years at onset, while the oldest case was aged 74. The age and sex-specific mortality rates for VCJD over the time period 1st of May 95 to 31st December 27 are shown in figure 6, and then there's a figure below. And the median duration of illness from the onset of first symptoms to death was 14 months, range from 6 to 114, compared with median duration of illness from the onset of first symptoms to death, compared with the median duration of illness for cases of SCJD of 4 months, with a range of 1 to 74 during the period 1990 to 2017. The last known UK case of VCJD was reported in 2016, with onset in 2014. It's right to understand then that these figures remain the same.
Yes, that's correct.
And that there is nobody living in the United Kingdom, so far as we know, with VCJD.
As far as I'm aware, that's correct.
And the numbers that we look at here reflect both the infections from the primary route and the secondary route.
I think that's correct. We just need to, I need to double check on that, but I'm sure the secondary cases are included.
And we'll look at there's a passage in that deals specifically with those secondary cases, which I'll come to in a moment. Is it right to understand that in terms of secondary transmission, there has not been a case of VCJD via surgical instrument, infected surgical instrument?
Yes, that's correct.
And is it also right that there has not been a case of vertical transmission of VCJD, by which I mean transmission from mother to fetus?
Yes, that's correct. This was looked at in specifically in a study that my colleague Professor Will and the clinical team published a few years ago, reinforcing that point.
And is it also right to say that there's not been a case of VCJD transmitted via sexual intercourse?
That's correct. These diseases do not appear to be transmitted through social or close contact.
If we can then turn, please, to page 15 of this report. We can see that this is the part of the report at the bottom that is headed TMER,
yes.
and it refers to further details in the 19th annual report, which I think you set out in your witness statement, which we'll go to in a moment. But it was what's over the page that I wanted to draw your attention to. And it says in that first paragraph there that there are 4 instances of probable transfusion-transmitted infection have been identified. So here we're talking about the secondary infections for VCJD. And it goes on to say, the first recipient, case 1, developed symptoms of VCJD 6.5 years after receiving a transfusion of red cells donated 3.5 years before the donor. Donor 1 developed symptoms of VCJD. The second recipient, case 2, died from a non-neurological disorder 5 years after receiving blood from a donor, donor 2, who subsequently developed VCJD. At post-mortem, protease-resistant prion protein was detected in the spleen, but not in the brain. So that is case 2 is an example of an asymptomatic infection of VCJD.
Yes, that's correct.
This was the first recorded case in the UK of autopsy detection of presumed pre- or subclinical VCJD infection. Now, just pausing there. Pre- or subclinical, we've been using the term asymptomatic. Can you just tell us what the difference is between the 3 terms?
Yes, well, asymptomatic means that the individual is infected but has no signs or symptoms, and we know that asymptomatic infection occurs with a whole range of other diseases, COVID, of course, being one of them, so that's what it is. The other terms, preclinical, it means the same thing, but it sort of assumes that it will be clinical shortly, and subclinical, I guess, means that, again, no symptoms, but may never develop symptoms. And because we can't be sure about those on an individual basis, I think asymptomatic is the preferable term, and then that would cover both groups as it were. So that's just my preference.
And then with somebody who subsequently becomes symptomatic, we could then go back and say, well, previously they were exhibiting preclinical symptoms.
Yes.
Because we know eventually they do become symptomatic.
Yes. If review of the clinical record showed subtle changes that could be attributed to this, but asymptomatic, I think, is preferable. And this case is such an important case because it really justifies the approach taken, or the decision to go ahead with the various appendix studies which are looking for asymptomatic infection.
And we'll come on to ask you some questions about the appendix studies and the prevalence work that you've been involved in. And then the report goes on, the third recipient, case 3, developed symptoms of VCJD 7 years, 10 months after receiving a transfusion of red cells, donated about 21 months before the donor, donor 3, developed symptoms of VCJD. And the fourth recipient, case 4, who received a transfusion from the same donor as case 3, developed symptoms of VCJD 8 years, 4 months after receiving a transfusion of red cells donated about 17 months before the donor, donor 3, developed symptoms of VCJD. So in relation to that third case and the fourth case, who are both are infected with VCJD from the same donor, what's the significance of that?
Well, I think that it shows that donor had enough infection in his or her blood almost 2 years before they developed symptoms, and because there's no, certainly no test that could have been done at the time to determine whether they were infected or not, but they were asymptomatic. And although they were asymptomatic, they were still infectious and therefore capable of inadvertently transmitting this infection through blood. I mean, blood is considered to be a low infectivity tissue or fluid, but if you get enough of it in a unit of blood transfused cells, red cells, there's enough infectivity to allow the infection then to spread in the host, in the recipient, sorry.
And the fact that one donor was involved in two infections, does that really put pay to any doubts about whether or not blood is the transmissible agent for VCJD?
I think, in effect, it does, and although this paragraph begins 4 cases of probable, but I think it's very, very likely. In fact, it's almost inconceivable. It isn't due to this, and especially with one donor and 2 infected recipients of that donation.
Now, is it and that's precisely what the next paragraph says.
Yes, exactly.
The identification of 3 cases of VCJD in the small cohort of known recipients of blood from persons incubating VCJD, together with the fact that 2 of the cases were associated with a common blood donor, establishes beyond reasonable doubt that blood transfusion is a transmission route for VCJD. And so, it's right to understand that although this is a report from 2017, because there have been no other cases of VCJD reported, that these figures remain the figures for infection via blood and blood components, i.e. 4 infections.
Yes, that's correct.
And then can we just pick up the matters that are in the further details that you've set out in your witness statement that appear in the 19th report of the TMER, I believe, and that is, so your witness statement is WITN 703 4001. And if we go, please, to page 22, and halfway down there, little paragraph 3, you say this: in the latest report of the results of the TMER study on the Research and Surveillance Unit website, dated 29th November 2019, it states 31 VCJD cases were reported to have been blood donors, and that's 4 additional cases who were not reported to have been blood donors were found to be registered with the UK BTS. One of these cases was found to have been a blood donor, while the other 3 cases were registered as donors but never made any donations. 24 of the cases have been traced at blood centres, including the 4 additional cases mentioned above. Components from 18 of these individuals were actually issued to hospital. It's been established that 67 components were transfused to named recipients, 53 of whom were dead and 14 alive. And so that's the latest figures from the TMER, latest figures from the TMER.
Yes, that's correct.
Now, moving on then to look at the position in the figures in terms of transmission to those who have received pooled plasma products, so not blood, whole blood or blood components. Can we look, please, at HCDO 40799? Now, this is an article co-authored by you and published in Hemophilia in 2010, entitled VCJD Infection in the Spleen of a Neurologically Asymptomatic UK Adult Patient with Haemophilia. And if we just look at the summary, that says that all UK patients with bleeding disorders treated with any UK source pooled factor concentrates between 1980 and 2001 have been informed that they may be at increased risk of infection with VCJD. And I'll come on to ask you some questions about that later on. We describe a study to detect disease-associated protease-resistant prion protein in 17 neurologically asymptomatic patients with haemophilia, considered to be at increased risk of VCJD. Materials from 11 autopsy and 7 biopsy cases were analysed for PRP-Res. The tissues available from each case were variable, ranging from a single biopsy sample to a wide range of autopsy tissues. A single specimen from the spleen of one autopsy case gave a strong positive result on repeated testing for PRP-Res by Western blot analysis. This tissue came from a 73-year-old male patient with no history of neurological disease, who was heterozygous methionine valine at codon 129 in the prion protein gene. So that's what you were telling us earlier, that's the MV genotype.
Yes, that's correct.
He had received over 9,000 units of factor VIII concentrate prepared from plasma pools known to include donations from a VCJD infected donor, and some 400,000 units not known to include donations from VCJD infected donors. He had also received 14 units of red blood cells and had undergone several surgical and invasive endoscopic procedures. Estimates of the relative risks of exposure through diet, surgery, endoscopy, blood transfusion, and receipt of UK-sourced plasma products suggest that by far the most likely route of infection in this patient was receipt of UK plasma products. So just trying to understand the context in which you were analysing these tissues. Is it right that this was part of the 5-year Department of Health funded project on people with haemophilia run by Professor Christine Lee?
Yes, that's correct.
And you set out there that you were involved in testing tissues from 17 people with haemophilia who were not exhibiting any neurological symptoms of VCJD. Were those the only entries, as I could put it, into that 5-year study?
At that time, yes. And these were individuals with haemophilia who had consented to become involved in that study and to allow any tissue samples that had been taken, and these could be either taken while they were alive, for example, a biopsy from an endoscopy procedure, because these tissues do contain lymphoid elements which could have PRP detectable where there, and an autopsy, 11 autopsy cases where a wider range of tissues were examined.
And in relation to the case where there was a positive result in the spleen, it's significant, is it, that was in relation to somebody who, in respect of whom you had autopsy tissue, because presumably you had a wide range of tissue, including from the central nervous system and the brain, and so you could tell how far the abnormal prion had reached.
Yes, that's correct, and in this particular case, it was only detectable in one area of one sample from the spleen, and in no other tissues, which is unusual and therefore presumably indicates a very early stage of infection.
Does the fact that it was found in the spleen tell us anything about the route? Does that tell us whether it's more likely to have been via oral route or via receipt of plasma products?
No, because the spleen is involved in variant CJD in primary infection, because the oral route allows the agent to replicate in the lymph. What seems to happen is the agent crosses the gut and replicates in the lymphoid tissues of the gut, the appendix, for example, and then spreads to other lymphoid tissues, the spleen, lymph nodes, tonsils. And then it takes longer to enter the nervous system. So we can't use this to say this must be the plasma products, or this could be an oral exposure. This patient had lived in the UK and probably had been orally exposed, and that's why we had to do an assessment based on relative risks, and that was done by Professor Simon Cousins, one of the other co-authors, who's an expert in analysing those sorts of risks. It's the statistical techniques are, I'm afraid, beyond my comprehension.
But in this particular individual, there were a number of different potential sources for the transmission of VCJD, and we've just looked at those. But the statistical analysis was that it was by far the most likely route of infection was by UK plasma products.
That was the conclusion, yes.
And it's not set out, I don't think, in this article, but I've seen reference in other documentation, but you may or may not be able to help in relation to this, but in other documentation I've seen, it's been suggested that in fact the statistical analysis was that it was more likely that the product from the if we go back, to the second column to the right of that summary. So we've got two sources of plasma product. We've got 9,000 units from a plasma pool known to include donations from a VCJD infected donor, and 400,000 units not known to include donations from VCJD infected donors. In other material, it's been suggested that it was thought more likely that the transmission would have come on a statistical basis from the 400,000 unit pool, if I can put it that. Is that anything you can help us with?
Yes, I think that does appear later in the discussion as that part of that article, but personally I'm not sure how the statistics works to allow you to reach that conclusion, but that was the conclusion that was reached. Although I think it's impossible to be absolutely certain about that.
But presumably the basis for that is the concern that there are asymptomatic donors contributing to the blood, contributing to the plasma pools.
Yes, that's correct.
And so because the 400,000 units is a bigger number than the 9,000, the likelihood increases even though there is not a known VCJD donor contributing to that larger pool.
Yes.
Do you know what the statistics are in terms of how many people with haemophilia are having post-mortems as we stand today in 2022?
I can't answer that question accurately. No, I'm sorry, I just can't. I mean, the numbers that we had at the time were written in the article, and I'd have to go back to the records in the unit to see how many others, but my suspicion is probably not very many.
And I think you've said in your witness statement that generally the rates of post-mortem are decreasing. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. And if you look in the the most recent annual report from the CJD, the autopsy rates are delineated and they are decreasing, obviously for variant CJD, because there haven't been any more cases and none have been identified, but even in sporadic CJD the numbers are decreasing, and that's a cause for some concern in terms of surveillance. Because
it may be that there are other, thinking of this cohort of people with haemophilia who are asymptomatic, who may have similar findings to the one we've just looked at, which would give you information about prevalence and about, what about prevalence, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Can we just look at one other document in which you were involved in examining brains of people with haemophilia, and that's HCDO 40133_024. This is a document entitled Retrospective Neuropathological Review of Prion Disease in UK Hemophiliac Patients, and it names you as a co-author, along with a number of other names that we are familiar with in the inquiry. This is undated. Do you recall whenabouts the... I think I've got in here 1998 as a date. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I think so. And I think I used this as a reference in my witness statement, and the publication dates, the information will be there. I can't remember the precise year, but it would be in the second half of the 1990s. Sounds about right.
I think I got the date 1998 from your witness statement.
Probably. Okay.
And if we just look then at the detail of it, if we go over to page 3, please, we can see subjects, methods and results. In order to examine the possibility of transmission of CJD via large pool clotting factor concentrates in the UK, we've examined the brains of 33 HIV-1 positive haemophiliac patients who had died from HIV/AIDS or liver disease. So just pausing here, this is not the 5-year study that we were just looking at funded by the Department of Health. This is examining the brains of those who had already died from HIV and AIDS.
Yes, that's correct. This was part of a multi-centre study, I think, that was supported by the Medical Research Council. It started before I began working in Edinburgh, and it involved groups of patients from London, Oxford and Edinburgh, and these were the groups involved, and so this was using the tissue that was available from these donors, which had been consented for research, to ask another question that wasn't foreseen at the time the original project was set up.
And I'll come on to ask you later on today about any involvement you might have had with the initial study of these patients from HIV and AIDS. And then if we go down the page, we see the 3/4 of the way through that paragraph, the patients were treated between the years 1962 to 1995 with a median 673,125 units of clotting factor concentrate, and then the range is between 83,700 and 2,833,249. For a median of 16 years, range 3 to 27, until the date of death, a total 500 patient years of treatment. The age at death was a median 42 years, range 15 to 79. And then if we go down to the bottom of the page, we can see what the result was. No, last sentence there, no evidence of spongiform encephalopathy was noted, and immunochemistry was negative for PRP in all cases. So that was the results in 1998 as a result of looking at 33 patients with haemophilia.
Yes.
And then by 2010, looking at 17, you have one positive result. Does that tell us anything, or are the samples just too small?
Well, I think the thing that tells us that really looking at the brain alone is not enough, and the brain in the case in the second study where the spleen was positive, the brain had no evidence of prion disease in it, and really I think if we'd it was a study that we felt we had to do, but if we'd found anything positive, it would have been really very worrying, I think. But anyway, that wasn't the case. But it was a study worth doing.
And that study, just to be clear, that study we're looking at here from 1998 was looking simply at samples from brains, tissue from brains.
That's correct.
Can we turn back then to your witness statement to deal with this next question that I have? It's WITN 7034001. And the question is, if we could turn to page 24, please, the bottom of page 24. The question I have for you, and then we'll look at what you've said in your witness statement about this, is why the extent of exposure a person requires to become infected. So that the question was put to you: what is the extent of exposure a person requires to become infected? And you said this: the question is difficult to answer, since a number of factors determine the risk of prion disease transmission, including the nature of the prion strain involved, the species of the donor and recipient, the amount of infectivity present in the material being transmitted, any interventions to reduce infectivity in the material concerned prior to exposure, and the route of exposure to infectivity. So a wide number of factors that you point out there. And then you go on to say this: the possible determinants of the risk of VCJD transmission by transfusion of blood and blood products are complex, but likely to include, and then you set out a number of issues, some of which we've touched on and some not, but I just wanted to run through these with you to try and understand your evidence on this. So levels of infectivity in donor population and prevalence of subclinical infection, geographical variation. So why is that relevant to whether or not somebody may become infected?
Yes, I see I've fallen victim to my own thing. I've used the term subclinical. I should have said asymptomatic, and I apologise for that. Yes, if you're looking at donor populations, let's say in different countries in Europe, let's say Germany, where there's been no case of BSE and no case of variant CJD, compared with the UK, then obviously the risk in the donor population in Germany is much lower than in here. That's an extreme example. There may well be geographical variations within the UK, and if we look in some of the surveillance unit reports, it says that it indicates there have been more cases of variant CJD per million population in the north of the UK as opposed to the south, and I think for sporadic CJD it's the other way around for some reason I've never been able to understand. It may be an artifact of surveillance. So that may play a part, and the other factors would, well, I think they're self-explanatory. I hope the extent of exposure of the recipient, the more potentially infected products you receive, the more likely you would probably be of developing the disease, and then interventions of measures to reduce infectivity, and I've mentioned the quantity of plasma or leukocytes within the component, and particularly leukocytes, because the leukodepletion of blood donations in the UK was introduced as a risk reduction, and it seems to have been effective because there have been no reports of variant CJD in recipients of leukoreduced red blood cell concentrates.
And just going back then up to 2A, infectivity of donation within incubation period. Presumably,
Yes.
You were saying earlier that when you looked at the person with haemophilia with the positive result in the spleen, that it seemed to be early in the infection, and so there's not so much. I don't know if that's the right way to put it. There's not so much infected prion, abnormal prion, and so if that person were to contribute to a unit to a plasma pool, then that it would be less infective than somebody who had more advanced disease. Is that right?
Yes, that would be correct. The amount of infectivity in these tissues will increase during the course of the incubation period, and the same applies in the nervous system. The initial infection will be at lower levels, but as the disease progresses and symptoms emerge, neurological symptoms, the amount of infectivity increases dramatically.
And that's the same for the blood, is it? So that the amount of infectivity in the blood will increase as the disease progresses?
That's likely. It may well be that eventually a state is reached where the lymphoid tissues and the circulating prions in the blood are as high as it can get, and it will remain at that level for a period. But in general, in the early stages, it will be increasing.
And then you go on in your witness statement to at number 3. Number 3, to look at susceptibility of recipient, and we've looked already at genotype, codon 129 PRNP at paragraph A there, and then you mentioned age, immune function, and other factors. I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about how that impacts on whether a person becomes infected.
Well, these are all possibilities. Age, for example, why has variant CJD generally occurred in young people? Are young individuals more susceptible to infection? And that has been a view that's been put forward. I think it's very difficult to prove, but it may well be that there is a case, and that age-related susceptibility may reflect how other factors work. For example, the maturity of the immune system, for example, or if individuals have other immune diseases, will that perhaps influence prion diseases? We know prion diseases don't trigger a conventional immune response, but impairment of immunity may result in other problems that precipitate death or would result in earlier death. And other factors are really factors we still don't know about. I mean, there may well be other genes that influence prion susceptibility, not just the prion protein gene, but other genes. And I know that my colleague in the Prion unit, Professor Simon Mead, is a particular expert in this, and they've been looking collaboratively with very large numbers of patients with prion diseases to identify other genes that may influence the susceptibility to these diseases. I think it's fair to say the prion protein gene is probably the major one, but there may well be others, and this is an area of active research at present.
And then I want to take you, please, to another study, which is NHBT 33619. So this is another study which you co-authored from 2012. Published in the Brain, the journal, A Journal of Neurology, or 2013, sorry, 2013. Yes. Prion infectivity in the spleen of a PRNP heterozygous individual with subclinical variant CJD. And if we look, please, at the text in the box at the bottom, it sets out at the beginning of that paragraph the background of blood transfusion in CJD. Yes. And if we look 6 lines down, where it says at the end of that line, it starts, a critical question for public health is whether the prion protein deposition reported in peripheral tissues from this MV individual, so we're talking here about the individual, with the MV individual, correlates with infectivity. In other words, can you transmit VCJD when you're asymptomatic? That's effectively what you're looking at there. And additionally, it's important to establish whether the PRNP codon 129 genotype has influenced the transmission characteristics of this infectious agent. Brain and spleen from the MV blood recipient were inoculated into murine strains that have consistently demonstrated transmission of the VCJD disease agent. And then it goes on to say, missing out that next paragraph, it says transmission of VCJD disease was observed from the MV blood recipient spleen, but not from the brain, whereas it was transmission from both spleen and brain tissues from the red cell donor. And then it goes on to say longer incubation times were observed for the blood donor spleen inoculum compared with the blood donor brain inoculum, suggesting lower titers of infectivity in the spleen. And then right at the bottom, that last sentence there, it says, these studies demonstrate that spleen tissue from a PRNP MV genotype individual can propagate the VCJD disease agent, and that the infectious agent can be present in the spleen without CNS involvement. So this is a study looking at that person with haemophilia, is that right, with the positive reading in the spleen?
No, actually, this is not looking at the haemophilia patient. This is looking at the case 2 of the blood recipients.
Yes.
And we were able, in this study, to compare, because we could identify who the donor of that blood was who died from brain CJD. So we had brain tissue and spleen tissue from the donor of the blood, and brain tissue and spleen tissue from the recipient of the blood. And the donor tissues had extensive prion protein accumulation in the brain and also in the spleen, but in the recipient there was no detectable prion protein in the brain, but there was in the spleen. And so the question we were asking is, does the detection of prion protein reflect the infectivity in it? Is it a good marker for biological infectivity? And the answer appears to be yes. I mean, we could conceive a situation perhaps where the brain was negative for prion protein, but because our tests are not sensitive enough to detect very small amounts, it still somehow might be infectious, but that was not found to be the case. On the other hand, the brain of the donor had large amounts of prion protein, and the infectivity in that brain was very high, much higher than in the spleen. But the recipient, it was in the spleen only, but not in the brain. And so that is in keeping with the idea of asymptomatic infection. It also actually gives some reassuring support to the methodology used in the appendix study, that the methods used to detect the abnormal prion protein do have some potential relationship to infectivity in these tissues.
So when we come to look at that, those findings in
Yes.
in the prevalence studies actually do relate to infectivity. So just pausing there then, what we understand, is this right, that there have been, in terms of secondary transmission of VCJD, the only method of secondary transmission of VCJD is through blood and blood products?
Yes.
That there have been 4 cases as a result of transmission via blood and blood components, and there has been 1 case which has been at an early stage and asymptomatic as a result of transmission from blood products. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yes, and that the latter case you mentioned is the haemophilia patient, and just to reinforce that the blood and the blood transmissions were all non-leukodepleted units of blood.
I'm going to turn now to look at the work that you did while you were on the CJD incident panel. Can we start by looking at the terms of reference for that body? It's WITN 709 1015. And if we go, please, to page 5 of that document, we have the terms of reference there. So they're quite lengthy. It's to assist individual health authorities or health boards and clinicians to decide on the most appropriate action to take to handle incidents involving potential transmission of CJD and variant CJD between patients through clinical interventions, including via surgical instruments, tissues, organs and blood, and to keep the relevant devolved administrations informed. So just pausing there, that presumably requires the panel to be informed by clinicians, health boards, that there's been an incident, and then the panel considers, with the expertise that it has, what the best way to deal with it is, and then gives advice. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And is it right to understand that there was no obligation on health authorities or health boards to refer incidents to the CJDIP? It was a voluntary system.
That's my understanding, yes.
And equally, that there was no obligation to follow the advice.
I mean, I really don't know if there was any legal obligation to follow it, but as far as I know, no, there wasn't. I mean, the panel could issue advice, and it was up to the health authorities to follow it or not.
And it maybe you can't help us with this, and these were questions better directed at Dr. Connor tomorrow. But
yes.
Do you have any sense of how well used as a resource the CJDIP was by clinicians?
Well, we certainly had lots of incidents referred to us, and some of these were historical incidents that happened perhaps in the few years beforehand. But there were live incidents, and this occasionally resulted in visits to individual trusts to talk through what actually had happened and what the options would be for the clinicians and the hospitals concerned.
Turning back then to the terms of reference, we see in the second paragraph there that also it's to consider what information should be collected on patients who may have been exposed, advise on what studies or follow-up may be needed, advise directors of public health on patient tracing and notification exercises where these are indicated, and advise on whether any other measures are needed to protect the wider public health. So I'm going to be asking you some questions about the notification exercises in due course, so that obviously falls squarely within the terms of reference of the panel. How does the surveillance, the aspects of surveillance that are set out there, how does that fit in with what you were doing up in Edinburgh in the research and surveillance unit? How did the two interrelate, or did they?
No, well, yes, no, they did interrelate to a very large degree, and there was a constant exchange of information between the panel and the unit, and the unit also was able to act as a source of advice to the panel in terms of confirming a diagnosis of whether a patient did or did not in fact have CJD. It may have been suspected, but was it probable or definite CJD, or was it just a possibility that had been subsequently excluded? So there's a lot of interaction.
And then third paragraph of the terms of reference, to make regular reports to SEAC and the ACDP TSE joint working group, and to keep the expert guidance under review and make recommendations to the joint working group for further guidelines as necessary in the light of experience of incidents and research in progress. So it's not immediately, it's clear from some of the documents that there was, or is this right, was there a direct route between the CJDIP and, for example, the Department of Health, so the CMO and indeed Secretary of State? There seems to be a direct route for information to be passed on. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. I think Dr. Connor would be better advised, better equipped to answer that question. But yes, that was the case, and the Department of Health was often represented at meetings of the panel.
So that's not necessarily reflected in these terms of reference, but in practice, that seems to be what happens. For example, the CJDIP sending the chief medical officers the framework agreement, for example, and getting sign-off on that document and so on.
Yes, I think that's right.
That you can take that down now, Lawrence. Thank you. So we know that the CJDIP had its first meeting in November 2000, and it's right, isn't it, that you were involved in the panel right from the very beginning?
Yes, that's correct, and I think my colleague Professor Will was also involved at that time.
And I'm going to ask you some questions now about the notification process of those that are considered to be at risk of VCJD for public health purposes. So is it right to understand that the principle that group of patients, and we'll come to look at how they were identified, that group of patients who were considered to be at risk of VCJD for public health purposes, that group should be notified that they were at risk so that they could take public health precautions? Was that principle one that was agreed and set on by the panel fairly early on in its workings?
Yes, I think that's correct. The identification of individuals, or those identified as being at increased risk, the level of risk is variable throughout these different groups, and so it was felt that the ones who were at the highest risk should be informed for a whole range of reasons, but including so they could undertake public health precautions and for example, not become blood or organ donors. But that, I mean, these are complex pieces of information that need to be explained very clearly, and there was a lot of debate about who should be informed and when and how.
And is it right to understand that the view that the panel took that they should be notified was a change from the previous, what had been done previously? So patients hadn't been told previously.
I think before the panel there was a lot of probably a lot. I mean, I don't really know for sure, to be honest, but it seems to me there was likely to be a lot of variability on how these individuals were dealt, the circumstances were dealt with. So, yeah, that's. I don't. Sorry, I've forgotten the first part of your question.
I was just. It may be that you don't know the answer, but it was. What I was suggesting to you was that the panel's decision to inform those that were at risk was a departure from what had happened before.
I think in many circumstances probably that's correct. I mean, we had in the panel lengthy debates on this, and there were lots of there were people there who are expert in ethics and law and other things, and debates about the right to know and the right not to know, or whether you ever should have a right not to know. But in effect, yes, that's a decision the panel made.
And your individual view about notification, did you think people should be notified?
I think that there were those who were at the highest risk should be notified in terms of their increased risk and also the fact that they themselves may represent risk to others.
And then just to understand the sort of time frame and the steps that the panel went through before we get to the actual decision making,
Yes.
the substantive decision making about who is at risk and how they should be notified. Is this right, that the panel determined that the correct way for them to proceed was to go out to consultation on a number of issues, including this notification issue? So they drew up a proposal saying effectively this is how we're going to operate, and then they went out to consultation on that. Within that consultation it said we intend to notify those who are at high risk.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes, that's my understanding, yes.
And having consulted on that, the panel then drew up what's called a framework document,
Yes.
which sets out effectively how they work and the reason that they work in that way, and sets out material about infectivity of tissue and blood components, and we'll look at that. But that framework document then had to be sent to the 4 chief medical officers for their approval before it could be published and widely disseminated. Was that the process?
That's what I recall, yes.
And while and in parallel with that sort of framework agreement being drawn up, which sets out the broad bones of what the panel were doing, the panel was drawing up a notification strategy in consultation with bodies like the UK HCDO and the Health Protection Agency about who should be notified and how they should be notified.
Yes, that's correct.
And again, we'll come and look at the detail of that in due course. And just sticking with the process, that notification strategy, who should be notified and how they should be notified, had to be signed off by the Department of Health. And in fact, the minister, one of the ministers in the Department of Health, got involved in that process.
I don't recall the minister, but yes, I don't recall the minister being involved, but that's probably correct. I'm going to have to refer to Dr. Connor on that one.
Well, we can pick that up with Dr. Connor tomorrow. So, as I understand it, the framework document was published in December 2003. Does that sound right to you?
Yes.
And we also know that the first notification exercise undertaken by the HPA and the CJDIP was in December 2003, notifying those that had received blood and blood components from donors who were infected with VCJD.
Yes.
And so I want to look at what the position was in the interim. So between November 2000, when there was the first panel meeting, and December 2003, we've got just over 3 years. Do you have any views or insights into why that process took 3 years? That's my first question.
It did seem to take a long time, and I think that process was lengthy because of the complex issues that had to be discussed, ranging from, as I said, ethics to law to medicine to risk assessments, all sorts of things. The consultation process was lengthy, and I felt that should have been more of a priority for those, particularly the other bodies that went to for consultation. And I think the outcome of the consultation should have been probably dealt with in a more rapid way to try and get to the place we've wanted to be in more quickly.
And next I want to ask you some questions about what happened in the interim, and I want to take you to a couple of documents to get your views on that. Now the first one is NHBT 301123_002. Now, just to orientate you in this document and then to explain what the inquiry knows about it, it seems to be a document, a Dear Colleague document to NHS medical directors CC'd into a number of other posts. And it's dated May 2001, and we don't need to go to it, but it's on the last page of the document. It appears to be from Pat Treat, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer.
Right.
Now, this is undated May 2001. The inquiry has other earlier versions of this from February 2001, for example. And it's not clear to the inquiry whether or not this was a document that was ever sent. So that will be one of my questions to you, but I just wanted you to understand that before we start going through the detail of it. And it may be that you don't know the answer to that, but nevertheless, we'll see where we go. So we can see that the title is VCJD, Patients Who Have Received Implicated Blood Products, Interim Guidance. And then it says in the first paragraph, it sets out the history of the establishment of the CJD IP, and it sets out what the panel's remit is. And it says that their proposals for managing incidents will be subject to consultation later this year, and in the case of blood and blood products will supersede the guidance issued by the department on 6th of February 1998, which is a document we will look at tomorrow when I present the chronology. Paragraph 2, it sets out the reason why presumably this document is being sent. In the meantime, there's been an incident involving blood products made from plasma donated in 96 and 97 by a person who subsequently developed VCJD, and then it sets out what the products are. And then if we go over the page, it sets out the reason why this guidance is being promulgated, if it was being promulgated, because presumably the panel were quite capable of giving advice in relation to the individual incident. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
But here we have the purpose. This interim guidance provides advice to hospitals on how to respond to patients who wish to know whether they or their children may have been given variant CJD implicated blood products, pending completion of the CJD incident panel's more detailed framework. This advice should serve for any other blood products incidents that arises between now and the completion of the panel's framework. And then it says that the panel is also considering the arrangements that should be put in place for informing recipients of red cells and other blood components donated by individuals who subsequently developed VCJD. This does not form part of this guidance. So it looks as though the Deputy Chief Medical Officer is realising that it would be helpful to have guidance that goes out to all the hospitals rather than people having to come in, individual hospitals having to come and ask the CJD IP on an individual basis, what should we be telling our patients if they're concerned about this? Do you recall, looking at that, do you recall discussion about this document?
To be honest, I don't.
And do you know whether or not this document was ever promulgated and sent round by the DCMO?
I don't know. The only thing I do recall is that I think the TMER study identified the circumstances that would trigger this as an individual who was diagnosed with variant CJD and then had been found to donate blood that had been used for fractionation.
If we could just go and look at the current advice to get your views on whether or not that reflected what in 2001 the panel were thinking, albeit it doesn't seem to reflect what ultimately the decision was in terms of notification. Current advice. The panel considers that members of the public have the right to know about specific incidents involving variant CJD, and if they wish, the right to know whether they have been exposed to a potential risk. An individual's right not to know that they have been exposed should also be respected. The panel is still in the process of developing guidelines on the best mechanisms for achieving these objectives. And I think that reflects what you told us that the subject of the discussions were about the notification issues.
Yes.
And then it sets out what the advice is pending the framework document being finalised. And if we in effect, what it says is that if patients want to know, first of all, hospitals must give them give them information, and it's set out on the following page, on page 3. The information that they should be told, that, for example, sporadic CJD, you can get sporadic CJD, roughly 1 in a million people worldwide, and no cases to date of VCJD transmitted by blood and so on. It can't be transmitted person to person, and it goes on down the list that there's no test for VCJD, and lastly at the bottom there, it's not always possible to establish whether they or their children have indeed received VCJD implicated blood products. And then over the page, so that's the first step, and then after this initial advice, patients who wish to know should be told if they have received one of the implicated batches, assuming this information is available from their hospital notes, and then it says information and support should be made available if needed. For patients who are informed that they have received one or more of the implicated batches, support may also be needed in cases where it cannot be established whether the patient received implicated products. So as far as you recollect, did this reflect the panel's thinking at that time, that patients had a right to know, but they ought to be informed about what they were actually asking before they then made the decision about whether they did want to know? So you give them the information, and then they choose whether they want to know whether they've been exposed to an implicated batch. Then, if they choose to know, you give them the information if you know it, if it's there in their records, but it must be with support.
I think in general that is correct. I mean, I think there was still a lot of debate about the right not to know, but this general approach, but certainly all the information should be made available to everyone who might possibly be involved, and then should they, as many I imagine would, want to know more information, then that information should be provided in as directly and in a timely way as possible, and by someone who is able to answer the questions that might arise, or there can be other forms of support put in place. And it's interesting just to see the date of this document, because this was only very shortly before the first case of transfusion-related variant CJD was in fact identified. So all the advice on that list is just going to become irrelevant, or some of it will be irrelevant. So the situation changes. It's a complex situation. It was just emerging, but nevertheless, up-to-date information is essential and should be provided, and I think that we were all concerned that that should be the case.
I just want to take you to one, no, I've got the time wrong, I think it was 12:30. I want to take you to another document dealing with this interim position, so between November 2000 and December 2003, when the framework agreement and the notification process took place, to see what was happening. If we look at, please, JPAC 5086_019. Now, this is a meeting of the Cjd working group on VCJD, 13th December 2002, and you actually send your apologies to that meeting. Would you, as a matter of practice, have received minutes of meetings where you sent your apologies?
I don't recall receiving this one, I have to say, but that I may have received it. I certainly don't have records of this, to be perfectly honest.
So I'm going to take.
But yes, I mean, you've sent it to me, and I've read it now, so I'm happy to speak to it.
I'm going to take you to page 2, and it may be yes. So if I take you to page 2.
Yeah.
And it's the paragraph that starts, there was discussion over the position with regard to informing the component and plasma product recipients of their exposure. So this is in relation to whether or not patients should be informed. And the advice from the Department of Health and Lothian Research Ethics Committee on establishment of the TMER study were to the effect that the recipient should not be informed. This advice had not formally been superseded. However, BPL needed to inform haemophilia directors in England that 3 batches of factor VIII were still in date and needed to be withdrawn. The haemophiliacs concerned were offered the opportunity of information at that time. So, and then if we go to the bottom of the page, that seems to be the position in England. At the bottom of the page, the position in Scotland, it said this: in Scotland, 1 donor has been identified who contributed to plasma products in 1987 to 1989, including factor VIII and factor IX defix, albumin and intramuscular immunoglobulin. An additional donor gave 2 blood components. On interim advice from the CGDIP, haemophilia directors and the doctors looking after the 2 patients who had received blood components were informed in November 2001, though the doctors involved did not inform the patients at that time because there was no clear guidance from the clinical incidence panel as to what they should be told. Advice in this regard has, to our knowledge, not been forthcoming. And then if we miss down in the next paragraph and say the working group expressed concern that definitive guidance was still not available from the CJDIP and that this was leading to differences in the way donors and patients were being managed in Scotland and England. And then if we go down to the paragraph that starts 3 blood transfusion recipients, 3 blood transfusion recipients have developed VCJD, and between them were exposed to 117 blood components, of which 111 have been traced to identified donors. Again, there are differences in the way these donors are being handled in England and Scotland. In England, the donors have not been notified nor deferred from donation. In Scotland, they have been deferred from donation but have not been notified. There was much discussion over the correct policy. And then if we skip down to the penultimate sentence there, it was considered that if the donors were to be permanently deferred on these grounds, they would have to be informed, which is likely to have a very negative impact. And then the last paragraph on this page, the committee did express concern that there appears to be a discrepancy in policy across the UK, and it's felt that this needed to be flagged to SACD, JPAC and the relevant medical directors. Now, do you recall this issue, that there were differences in the way that patients were being treated between England and Scotland arising, it looks from here, as a result of the delay in the framework agreement being signed off and agreed?
Yes, I mean, the information in this report is not unfamiliar to me, and it was a matter for some considerable concern.
And is it right to understand that really this was only concluded, as it were, once in December 2003, once the framework agreement was published, and the panel knew that they had sign-off from the Department of Health and the chief medical officers about their method of working, and so that could then be applied across the 4 nations?
Yes, I mean, that again, this is one of the issues that needed to be addressed, and that's why they had to get sign-off from all the devolved administrations, the CMO in each, to do this, because it was clear that it wasn't a level playing field.
I'm not sure threatening is the right word, but kept saying I'm going to turn to the framework agreement. Now is the time to turn to the framework agreement. Could we have, please, DHSC 002 0839_003? Now we can see that's headed CJDIP, and it's called Management of Possible Exposure to CJD Through Medical Procedures Framework Document. And we can see at the bottom that it's version 3, dated 1st of December 2003. And then if we go, please, to page 5, we can get an idea of what this document is. This is part of the foreword. And if we go down, please, to the 3rd paragraph, it says this document sets out proposals for managing incidents involving possible exposure to TSE agents in healthcare settings. Incidents arise when patients who are diagnosed or suspected of having TSE are found to have undergone a medical procedure at some time in the past. Other patients could be put at risk if the TSE agent is transmitted through contaminated instruments and or devices, or donated blood, or other tissues or organs. And just pausing there, TSE includes VCJD, is that right?
Yes, the term TSE is really an old term for prion diseases. They used to be called the transmissible spongiform encephalopathies. So that's what it means.
And then the next paragraph says, this framework document has been considered by the Chief Medical Officers for the UK. While they supported most of the proposals within this paper, they have not decided on the proposal to establish a confidential database without consent. And then if we go down to the last paragraph, please, it just makes the point that this document particularly draws on 2 reports: the risk assessment for transmission of VCJD via surgical instruments and modelling approach in numerical scenarios, and an assessment of the risks of exposure to VCJD infectivity in blood and blood products, referred to as the blood risk assessment. And that was the 2003 risk assessment, was it? Carried out by
DNV.
DNV.
Yes.
I'm not going to, I can't.
No, Denos Veritas.
Yes. Veritas. As an update to their 1999 blood risk assessment. And so that's what that's referring to. If we then please go to page 7, we can see the executive summary. And what's said there is that in the third paragraph down, the document is intended for the whole of the UK, and the Department of Health has set up an expert group to advise all those bodies responsible for the provision and delivery of healthcare on the most appropriate action to take to handle incidents involving potential transmission of CJD between parties through clinical interventions, including via surgical instruments, tissue, organs or blood. And then it sets out that that expert group is in fact the CJDIP. And then if we go to page 9, we can see what the framework document says about notification, informing some individuals about their exposure to TSE contactable group. There is a small subgroup of possibly exposed people which the panel consider to be at sufficient risk to warrant public health action. It's proposed that these people are contacted and informed about their exposure so that they can be advised not to donate blood or organs, and so they can alert their healthcare provider to the potential exposure if they require any surgical procedure in the future, including dental or ophthalmic procedures. And then it says that mechanisms are put in place to alert the blood service and organ donation bodies when a contactable individual is identified, to prevent those individuals from donating blood, organs and tissues. And then at the last paragraph there, before providing publicity, the provision of an adequate mechanism for informing and counselling individuals within this contactable group is a crucial component of the panel's proposals. So that's front and centre, is it, to the proposal that there should be notification.
Yes.
That the mechanism for informing them must be adequate, and we'll come on to look at that, and that there should be counselling of those individuals.
Yes, absolutely.
So the framework agreement is general. It doesn't go down to the specifics, and we'll come to look at the specifics and how the panel came to that in a moment. But just sticking with the framework agreement, can we go please to page 31 to understand what the agreement says about the estimates of infectivity in blood blood components and plasma derivatives. So is this right, that the framework agreement effectively sets out its estimates based on the blood risk assessment of the infectivity for whole blood, red cells, and certain plasma derivatives, factor 8, factor 9, and so on?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, if we look at page 34, please. We can see, I just want to draw attention to two things here. First of all, table 7, and then secondly, paragraph 2.99. So table 7 says the possible infectivity levels of blood components in variant CJD, and it sets out the components down the left, and then it sets out infectivity per mil, IV, ID 50 per mil, that's expressed as, and then infectivity per unit. Now, just to understand what IV, ID 50 means, what does it mean?
Well, IV stands for intravenous, and the capital ID 50 is an infectious dose, and it's the dose at which 50% of individuals receiving that dose would become infected. So the IV ID 50 is the dose, the intravenous dose, at which half the recipients would expect to become infected.
So with that in mind, what does that tell us about, for example, plasma? What does the 2 in the infectivity per mil mean, and what does the 500 in the infectivity per unit mean?
Well, a unit of, I say this as a neuropathologist, I'm not a blood transfusion expert, but I have a rough understanding, having listened to these debates many times over many years, that a unit of blood contains a number of hundreds of milliliters, and so basically you're multiplying the ID 50 per mil up into the ID 50 per unit, depending on how many mils are in a unit of blood, a unit of plasma. And it's interesting to see that the infectivity in whole blood and plasma per mil is low, but if you, as I said earlier, I think if you receive enough of it, you'll reach quite a large dose. So we know from study of prion diseases in animals that in blood the infectivity is mostly in white cells and in plasma. So if you're looking at white cells and platelets, there's really quite a higher level of infectivity than in plasma, and in whole blood it's also lower. And red cells alone are very low.
So what does this tell us about, so for example, if one were to get a unit of whole blood, what does that tell us about the infectivity of a single unit of whole blood? In terms of the infective dose. So
it basically means in a unit of whole blood, non-leukodepleted, that let me get this one. Yes, the intravenous. Yeah, it basically means you'd expect to have a large number of infections from a single unit. And I think rather than speaking about ID50s, I think there's been other ways of looking at it, that 1 unit of blood is enough to infect more than one person if it was distributed in that way. So it's really a multiplication factor, and because this unit of blood is a larger volume than a unit of plasma or white cells, the infectivity is larger because the volume is larger.
So is this what this tells us, that there's 2 infective doses as you defined us,
yes.
as you defined as you defined an infective dose, per milliliter of whole blood. Is that what
Yes.
that tells us?
Yes.
So for 2 millilitres of whole blood, there are 2 infective doses. So half of two lots of people will be infected.
Yes, that's right. And then the amount of infectivity and a unit of blood is going into one individual, and they're receiving 900 ID50, so the chance of them being infected is really very high.
But with that in mind, can we then look at paragraph 2.99? The figures in Table 7 are based on very uncertain estimates from the blood risk assessment that are derived from the data from Brown et al. 1998. So how confident were the panel in those figures there set out for the blood components?
There's always an element of uncertainty about this, and I think if we go back to the earlier DNV risk, the 1999 risk assessment, which I think there were a lot of problems with that risk assessment, and it didn't take into account all the data that was emerging from the animal model studies, and it made assumptions about whether there was a plateau effect for infectivity or whether increasing doses would just continue to increase the risk, and that there was a huge debate about that. So I think the 2003 DNV report, which was designed to be more focused on this particular area, was an improvement. I think people accepted it as being an improvement, although still uncertainties. And relying on the data from Paul Brown and others, I have to say, in experimental models, experimental animal models, there are always questions about that. How representative are these of the human infection? Some of the models use strains of prions which are not the same as the variant CJD strain, or the levels of infectivity in the tissues can be generally far higher than we find in human prion diseases. So there's always a question about the relevance, but the principles are the same. And I think most people would agree that the most infectivity is present in plasma and in the white cells. And that's why removing the white cells by leukodepletion might be a good idea.
And then if we look at the equivalent table for blood, for plasma derivatives, that's at page 36. We can see on the left-hand side there different derivatives, factor VIII low specific activity, factor VIII highly purified, factor IX, and so on. And we can see the potential infectivity, 0.1 infective doses per standard dose of 2,000 international units. So we understand that to mean that 0.1 infective doses per standard use of 2,000 international units. Is that right?
Yes, an individual dose of 2,000 international units would have 0.1 of an ID50, which is the dose at which half of the recipients would expect to become infected. So the fact that it's 0.1 of that means the risk is low.
And if we go back to page 35, please, the bottom of page 35, we can see what the infectivity at the bottom, 2.108. The risk from plasma derivatives is even more uncertain than from blood components. So again, very heavily, these figures seem to be very heavily caveated by the panel as being very uncertain. Is that right?
Yes, and I think part of the reason is due to the processing steps and fractionation steps that take place, and there was a lot of debate about how much these fractionation steps to produce factor VIII or factor IX would reduce the infectivity, or where the infectivity would remain in that. There seems to be the modelling of that in animals is difficult to translate straight to the human situation, and I'm sorry, I'm not a hematologist, but I'm sure others can give better advice than I can on this, but it just seemed to me that we were aware that with the plasma derivatives, because of the additional processing that goes on, there's yet more variables, if you like, to take into account.
And is it right also to understand that the figures that were the figures in the DNV blood risk assessment in 2003 were based on the most pessimistic assumptions?
Yes, that's right, and it's a question of whether these are justifiable to use, and I think that it's always debatable as to where you, given the uncertainty generally, where you should go to, but if you're being precautious, then perhaps there is an argument for using a pessimistic assumption, or at least to use the pessimistic assumption and then see how that turns out. And if it turns out to be correct, then it's justified. If it isn't, perhaps it should be reviewed and the situation revisited.
And so the situation we're in now in 2022, where there hasn't been a case of VCJD since 2016, does it look like taking the most pessimistic assumptions perhaps wasn't justified, and that the figures that we're looking at are likely to be an overestimate of the infectivity levels?
Well, that's one way of looking at it. I suppose that another way would be that the pessimistic assumption has prevented large numbers of transmissions.
Yes, I didn't mean it wasn't unjustified in a critical way.
No, I understand.
Yes.
I understand your point. I think there's a whole range of other reasons why these scenarios should be revisited now in terms of the epidemiology of variant CJD generally, and in fact, as you're aware, MHRA has conducted a review of the use of hyperimmune plasma and related to COVID infection and the VCJD risks for that. And I haven't read the detail of that, but I imagine that includes a more updated risk assessment for variant CJD than was available in 2003.
So those are the questions I wanted to ask about this document. I'm going to come on and look at the decision-making about the panel undertook to decide who precisely should be notified. But I note the time.
Yes, well, we'll take a break now then, shall we, till 20 to 2. 20 to 2.